It was the opening day of Madrid's most exclusive tennis club when Alejandro Vega, billionaire CEO of the Vega Industries empire, made the most arrogant bet of his life. In front of 300 guests from Madrid's high society, he looked at the janitor cleaning the courts and laughed contemptuously. Marco Herrera, 29, had worked there for 3 years to support his ailing mother, enduring the humiliation of being treated as invisible every day. But when Alejandro proposed that impossible challenge to him in front of everyone, "Beat me at tennis, and I'll marry you to my daughter," no one imagined that this silent janitor was hiding a secret that would shake all certainties. Because sometimes those who are underestimated possess a talent that can turn the tables. And sometimes the arrogance of the powerful clashes with the determination of those who have everything to prove and nothing to lose. Marco Herrera arrived at the La Moraleja Tennis Club at 5 in the morning, as he had been doing for the past 3 years. At 29, his athletic body concealed a tiredness that went beyond physical fatigue. It was the tiredness of someone who fights a silent battle every day against indifference and contempt. The club was the most exclusive in Madrid, frequented by the elite of Spanish society. Businessmen, bankers, politicians, heirs to historic dynasties, people who spent on a tennis class what Marco earned in a month. Their job was to keep the courts in perfect condition, clean the locker rooms, organize the equipment, and, above all, remain invisible. For the partners of the moral, Marco had no name, history, dignity. It was simply the janitor staring back at you like a ghost, part of the furniture that no one really noticed. Marco had a story that no one knew. The son of a small businessman who died when he was 16, he had to abandon his studies to work and support his mother Carmen, now 62 and suffering from severe rheumatoid arthritis. The treatments were expensive, the necessary medications were not fully covered by public health care, and the apartment in the suburbs where they lived required constant repairs. That May morning saw the first preparations for the most important event of the year, the opening of the club's new pavilion, a party that would see the presence of 300 guests, all belonging to the CREM of Madrid society. Alejandro Vega arrived at 9 o'clock sharp in his black Maserati, accompanied by his daughter Carmen. At 45, Alejandro was the embodiment of business success, tall, elegant, with that air of superiority that comes from the certainty of never having to fight for anything. He had inherited Vega Industries at age 28 and transformed it into a real estate and financial empire. Carmen was 25 years old and was considered one of the most beautiful and coveted women in Spain. Sophisticated blonde with a degree from ESAID and a master's degree from London. She was used to having everything she wanted. But in recent years, she had begun to feel a void that all the privileges couldn't fill. As they crossed the runways, heading to the party hall, Alejandro noticed Marco repairing a small crack on runway number 3. He watched him for a few seconds. He then turned to the club director, who was accompanying them. The manager explained that Marco had been working there for 3 years as a maintenance manager, and was very good and reliable. Alejandro smiled that grimace his employees knew well, asking if the janitor knew how to play tennis. The idea began to form in Alejandro's mind at that moment. He was famous for his displays of power, for the pleasure he took in humiliating those he considered inferior. And that night, in front of Madrid's elite, he would put on a show. Marco, meanwhile, continued his work, completely ignoring the conversation. He had learned long ago not to listen when his associates talked about him. He concentrated on the mechanical gestures of maintenance, thinking about his mother waiting for him at home, the pharmacy bill he had to pay, the electricity bill that had arrived that morning. He didn't know that Alejandro Vega had just decided to make him the unwitting protagonist of the most public humiliation of his life. He didn't know that that night, in front of 300 witnesses, he would be pilloried for the entertainment of the rich. But Marco Herrera had a secret, a talent he had hidden for years, buried beneath everyday needs and forced humility. A gift that would emerge that night in such a clamorous way that it would forever change the destiny of all the protagonists of this story. The party was in full swing when Alejandro Vega decided to put his plan into action. The Moral Hall shone with crystal chandeliers. Waiters served Dom Perignon champagne, and the cream of Madrid society chatted in small, exclusive groups. Businessmen discussed multi-million-dollar mergers, politicians forged alliances, heiresses showed off jewels worth fortunes. Marco was discreetly arranging the buffet tables when Alejandro stepped onto the small stage set up for official speeches. The clinking of a glass against the crystal caught the attention of all the guests. Alejandro began his speech by celebrating the opening of the club's new pavilion and the excellence that characterized them. La Moraleja was the temple of Madrid tennis, frequented only by the best. Applause filled the room as Alejandro waited for the right moment to strike. He then announced that he wanted to make the evening even more memorable with a little demonstration. Among them was someone who worked every day to keep those courts perfect, but who had probably never had the opportunity to play on them. The glances began to move in confusion as Alejandro called out to Marco, pointing him out as his valued concierge. Marco felt his blood run cold. All eyes were fixed on him, 300 pairs of pupils scrutinizing him with morbid curiosity. He approached the stage slowly, feeling the weight of the humiliation that was brewing. Alejandro continued with false cordiality, introducing him as Marco, who had given 3 years of impeccable service. Then he asked him if he had ever played tennis. Marco looked at that crowd of aristocratic faces that watched him like an animal in a cage. His first reaction was to escape the public scrutiny, but something in Alexander's disdainful tone, in his arrogant smile, in the chuckle that pierced the crowd, ignited a flame in him that he thought had been extinguished for years. When he confirmed that he had played, Alejandro laughed along with half the room. Then came the proposal that would change everything, a challenge that would make the evening unforgettable. If Marco the janitor managed to beat him in a tennis match, Alejandro would do something extraordinary. He would give him his daughter in marriage. A murmur of shock ran through the crowd. Carmen paled. Marco was petrified. Alejandro continued smiling, enjoying the audience's reaction. Naturally, he added that if Marco lost, which he certainly would, he would have to publicly apologize for daring to accept such a ridiculous challenge, and then immediately leave the club for good. Marcos felt rage rise like a tide, not for himself, but for his mother, who had sacrificed everything to raise him with dignity, for all the workers, janitors, waitresses, who were trampled every day by the arrogance of the powerful, for all those who worked in silence while others took the credit. Marco's acceptance was firm and decisive. The room erupted in excited murmur as Alejandro clapped with satisfaction. The slopes were lit. They had everything they needed. The show could begin. As the crowd headed toward the outside dance floors, Carmen approached Marco. She was pale, and her eyes were filled with tears of rage. She apologized for her father's cruelty, but Marco reassured her with an enigmatic phrase. Maybe that night his father would have a surprise. Carmen looked at him confused, but didn't have time to ask for explanations. The crowd was pushing them toward the slopes, toward what everyone believed would be a one-sided sporting massacre. No one knew that Marco Herrera, before becoming a janitor, had been something more, something he had jealously hidden for 3 years, buried under humility and necessity. That night, under the spotlight of the morality tale, that past was about to emerge explosively. As Alejandro headed toward the locker room, certain of imminent victory, Marco stood motionless in the center of the floodlit court. The crowd settled into the stands, excited at the thought of witnessing the janitor's humiliation. Marcos closed his eyes for a moment and let himself be transported back in time. 15 years earlier, he was a Madrid youth tennis phenomenon, a 3-time national under-16 champion, and a promising candidate for a scholarship to study in America. His father, Jose, had sacrificed everything for that dream, investing every euro in his son's extraordinary talent. Then fate changed everything. Jose died of a heart attack at the age of 43, leaving Marco with debts and the responsibility of supporting his mother. Tennis became an impossible luxury. Rackets sold, dreams shelved, talent buried beneath everyday needs. Alejandro returned with expensive equipment, accompanied by the club's manager with the best rackets. With theatrical magnanimity, he invited Marco to choose, not wanting excuses for defeat. When Marco grabbed a Wilson Pro staff, the same model as before, something woke up in his muscles, a dormant but never dead body memory. The warm-up revealed everything. Marco started timidly, the first blows uncertain. The crowd laughed. Alejandro smiled with satisfaction. But gradually something changed. The movements began to flow. The blows found precision. The timing became natural again. Carmen watched this transformation fascinated. The clumsy janitor was becoming an athlete before his eyes with fluid movements and natural grace. The referee called for the start of the match. Alejandro served with force, a blow he believed he had already won. Marco didn't move until the last second. He then unleashed a parallel backhand that zipped past Alejandro, crashing into the line with a thud. The first point went to the janitor. At that moment, everyone understood that this would not be the trip they had imagined. The silence that followed that first point was deafening. 300 people stood there speechless, unable to process what they had just seen. The janitor had just returned Alejandro Vega's serve with a backhand that would have been worthy of a professional. Alejandro shook off his torpor and positioned himself for the second serve. But now there was a small wrinkle of worry on his forehead. He served again, this time looking for the other corner of the court. Marco moved easily and responded with a right cross that forced Alejandro into a desperate run. The point was his once again. From that moment on, the game became something magical and terrifying at the same time. Marco wasn't just playing, he was dancing. Every move was perfect, every shot placed with pinpoint precision that made even the club's best players pale. The first set flew by in 20 minutes. 6 for Marco. Alejandro won only his service turn of the fourth game, and only because Marco seemed to grant it to him out of mercy. The crowd had gone from amusement to discomfort, from discomfort to astonishment, from astonishment to religious silence. During the track change, Carmen stood up and approached Marco while drinking water. His question about who he really was received with an enigmatic answer. He was just a janitor, as his father had always said. But when Carmen insisted, noting that he played like a pro, Marco responded with a bitter truth about dreams that sometimes die, but talent that remains like a scar. The second set began with Alejandro visibly affected. He had understood that he was facing someone completely different from what he had imagined, but his arrogance prevented him from accepting reality. He began to play more aggressively, attempting risky shots, trying to recover with strength what he couldn't achieve with technique. Marco, on the other hand, seemed to be getting more and more into the game. Are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now we continue with the video. 15 years of frustration, humiliation, and denied dreams emerged from each blow. He wasn't just playing against Alejandro Vega. He was playing against everyone who had underestimated him, against everyone who believed that money was worth more than talent, against a system that trampled on those without recommendations. The public was now completely on his side, although he did not dare to show it openly. Watching this young man, who had been cleaning his tracks for 3 years, reveal such extraordinary talent was both touching and embarrassing. The second set ended 6-0. Alejandro failed to win a single game. His blows had become imprecise, his movements stiff. The humiliation he had planned for Marco was backfiring in spectacular fashion. During the second lane change, Alejandro approached Marco, his face red with rage and embarrassment. His aggressive question about who he really was finally given a complete answer. Marco Herrera, 3-time national under-16 champion known as the Phenomenon, before life taught him that dreams are a luxury not everyone can afford. Alejandro paled. Now I understood. Now it all made sense. But it was too late to retreat, too late to save face. In front of 300 witnesses, he had to finish that match that was turning into his worst nightmare. The third set was a formality. Marco won 6-0, concluding the match with an ace that Alejandro didn't even see. The final score was 61-60-60, a total and complete sporting humiliation. When the referee announced Marco's victory, The silence of the crowd was broken by a slow, uncertain applause that gradually became deafening. Everyone stood up, including those who just minutes before had been laughing at the idea that the janitor could compete with Alejandro Vega. Marco stood motionless in the center of the court, racket in hand, his breathing still steady. For him, it had been a training match. He looked at Alejandro sitting on the bench with his head in his hands and felt a strange pity for that man who had built his superiority on the humiliation of others. Then his eyes met Carmen's, who was looking at him with admiration, respect, and something else he didn't dare interpret. The game was over, but the story was just beginning. The silence that followed the end of the match was charged with electric tension. Everyone looked at Alejandro Vega, waiting for his reaction. The most powerful man in the club, perhaps in all of Madrid, had been publicly humiliated by someone he considered the last of the last. Alejandro slowly rose from the bench, his face a mask of suppressed rage and wounded pride. He approached Marco, who was waiting motionless in the center of the track, still in disbelief at what had just happened. Her congratulations were icy, accompanied by a declaration that she would never keep a promise made in jest. But Carmen's voice cut through the air like a blade. She had gotten up from the stands and was walking down the court, firmly declaring that her father had made a promise in front of 300 witnesses and would keep it. Alejandro turned to his daughter in disbelief, protesting that he was just a janitor. But Carmen replied that he was a man who had just shown her that a person's worth is not measured by their bank account, and, above all, that he had more honor than she did. His daughter's words hit Alejandro like slaps. Looked around. 300 pairs of eyes scrutinized him, waiting to see if the man who preached excellence and honor would keep his word. Marco watched the scene, still not believing what was happening. The daughter of his former boss, one of the most desirable women in Spain, was defending her right to that absurd promise. But as he watched her, he realized that there was something different in those gray eyes than he had always thought. When Marco gently protested that she couldn't marry someone she didn't know, and especially not to honor a bet her father had made, Carmen looked at him for a long time before answering. She couldn't marry someone she didn't know, but she could get to know him. He turned to the father with determination, declaring that the promise would be kept, but in his own way. She asked Marcos if he would agree to go out with her, to give her the chance to get to know him as the person he was, not as the janitor everyone saw him as. A murmur of astonishment ran through the crowd. Nobody expected that turn of events. Marco felt like he had no footing, going from being publicly humiliated to being courted by the richest heiress in Madrid. When Marco expressed his doubts about their very different lives, Carmen replied that perhaps those very differences made them interesting. Alejandro attempted a last desperate attack, defining Marco as a janitor with no future who had deceived everyone with that spectacle. But Carmen did not hesitate. He described Marco as a janitor who had just given him the most important lesson in humility of his life, and above all, a man who had sacrificed his dreams to take care of his mother. This was the kind of person I wanted to meet. Marco felt his heart fill with emotion. No one had ever spoken about him like that. No one had seen beyond his current condition to recognize the sacrifice he had made. When he finally agreed to go out with Carmen, specifying that her life was simple and she couldn't offer him luxuries, she replied that she didn't care about fancy restaurants. I wanted to meet the man who had hidden an extraordinary talent for 3 years without ever complaining, the one who had learned in real life. The crowd began to applaud spontaneously. Even the most snobbish among those present had been impressed by this display of character. Marco and Carmen shook hands at center court under the spotlight, in front of witnesses who had witnessed something much more important than a tennis match that night. Alexander stood alone, abandoned even by his most faithful flatterers, who now looked with admiration at this unlikely pair. For the first time in his life, he realized that power and money couldn't buy everything. As the crowd dispersed, Marco and Carmen stood talking in the center of the illuminated dance floor. It was the beginning of a story that would change them both forever. 6 months after that memorable night at La Moraleja, Marco Herrera's life had changed in ways he could never have imagined. He hadn't married Carmen Vega, not yet, But he had won something much more valuable: her heart and her respect. Their first dates had been revealing for both of them. Carmen had discovered a world she didn't know. He had met Marco's mother, Carmen, a 62-year-old woman who, despite her illness, had raised a son with strong values and unconditional love. I had seen the apartment on the outskirts where Marco lived, small and impeccably kept, full of family photos and memories of a glorious tennis past. Marco, for his part, had discovered that behind the facade of the capricious heiress was an intelligent, sensitive woman deeply dissatisfied with the empty life she had always led. Carmen had a never-used degree in economics. He actually spoke 4 languages without ever having worked. He owned everything, but he didn't feel useful to anyone. The turning point had come when Carmen suggested to Marco that they return to playing tennis professionally. He had offered to pay for his coach, tournaments, and all the support necessary to recover his abandoned career. Marco had refused, not wanting to be supported by her. Their first real argument had arisen from this. Marco had accused Carmen of wanting to solve everything with money. She had retorted that he was too proud to accept help. They went a week without speaking to each other. Then Alejandro Vega had Marco de la Moralija fired with a pretextual excuse. When Carmen heard the news and suggested talking to her father, Marco stopped her. He didn't want him to fight with his father over it. I had always known that this moment would come. At that moment, Carmen had truly understood who the man she was falling in love with was. Marco never asked for anything, never complained, never allowed difficulties to defeat him. He was the strongest person I had ever met. Carmen's proposal had come that night, to open a sports center for young talents from the outskirts, kids who, like Marco, had natural talents, but lacked the financial means to develop them. He would be the technical director and the head coach. Not charity, but a true partnership. She has the capital. He has the skills and experience. Marco had accepted. The Nuevos Talentos Sports Center had opened 3 months later in a working-class neighborhood of Madrid. In a short time, it had become a point of reference for young athletes from all over the community of Madrid. Marco had rediscovered his passion for tennis, but above all, he had found a purpose: to prevent other kids from losing their dreams due to lack of money. Alejandro Vega had initially disinherited Carmen for what he considered madness. But when he saw the center's first results, when newspapers began writing enthusiastic articles about the young talents emerging from Madrid's outskirts, he had to reconsider his position. The final episode had occurred during the first tournament organized by the center. Marco was coaching a 14-year-old boy who reminded him a lot of himself at the same age when he had seen Alejandro enter the club. The 2 men had looked at each other for a long time. Then Alejandro had approached. The admission of error had come simply and directly. She had made a mistake about Marco, about her daughter, about that whole place. It was extraordinary. When Alejandro had asked if Marco would agree to marry his daughter, specifying that he no longer needed his approval, but wanted to give it to her anyway, Marco had smiled, revealing that he had already asked her to marry him the night before. She had said yes. The wedding had been held 6 months later, precisely on the slopes of the Nuevos Talentos Center. There weren't just 300 high society guests, but all the kids Marco coached, their families, colleagues from the center, and finally Alejandro Vega, who had learned to respect the man his daughter had chosen. During the reception, Marco and Carmen had danced on the same dance floor, where the training camp once stood. Looking into her eyes, Marco understood that sometimes life offers you a second chance when you least expect it. Carmen had reflected on how that night in the Moral her father thought he was humiliating him, but in reality he had brought together 2 people who complemented each other perfectly. Marco had kissed her under the spotlights, which once illuminated his humiliation and now illuminated his happiness. Around them, dozens of children played and laughed on the slopes where it all began. Sometimes you have to hit rock bottom to rise higher than before. Sometimes the arrogance of those who have everything clashes with the dignity of those who have nothing and always lose. And sometimes love is born in the most unlikely places between people who seem to have nothing in common, but who recognize each other deep in their hearts. Marco Herrera had won much more than a tennis match that night. He had gained a new life, a family, and the opportunity to help others realize their dreams. Because true success is not measured by what you get for yourself, but by what you can give to others. Like it. If you believe that true talent cannot be hidden forever, comment on what moment in the match made you hold your breath. Share to inspire those who believe that humility is stronger than arrogance. Subscribe for more stories of impossible revenge and love born of respect. Sometimes those who are underestimated hide surprises that change everything. Sometimes arrogance clashes with pure determination. And sometimes a challenge born to humiliate becomes the beginning of the most beautiful love story. Because the true value of a person is not measured by what they possess,